Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Dave Clark. I'm the Group Chief Executive Officer of the Aurum Institute in Johannesburg and also an adjunct professor at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining this presentation today, which is about COVID vaccines, facts and myths. The purpose of the presentation today is to share a balanced view of the COVID-19 vaccine situation relevant to South Africa. We're going to take a look at the technology behind them and how they work, both in individuals and in the community. And then we're going to discuss some of the benefits of COVID-19 vaccination. It will also be really good to have a look at vaccine hesitancy and what drives it, some of the reasonable concerns that you probably have, as well as some of the conspiracy theories and fake news. We do need to remind ourselves of God's sovereignty and power in this epidemic, and I'll touch on that. And finally, I hope to make some recommendations on vaccination that you can give some thought to. The presentation itself has several links that you will see to further information by way of websites and videos. And I would encourage you, if you are interested, to download this presentation separately as a PowerPoint presentation, so that you can look into each one of those links, because we're not going to go into all of them for the sake of time. Lastly, before I continue, I'd like to give acknowledgement and thanks to the eldership at Honey Ridge for commissioning this presentation, and also to my colleague Dr. Michelle Groom at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases for her contributions and insights into this preparation. I'm not going to keep the camera on throughout this, because we want to focus on the slides. So let's dive in. We're going to be now looking at COVID-19 vaccines, facts versus fiction. So let's take a look at the state of the epidemic in South Africa. As we stand today, and I'm talking to you on the 27th of June, you can very clearly see that there's a well-established third wave in progress in South Africa. In fact, on the 25th, just 2 days ago, there were 18,700 cases. And this is being mirrored by the number of deaths that you can see on the right-hand side. It is important to note that this graph that you see here, showing the 3 waves, is in fact the rolling 7-day average of cases. And the actual number of cases is getting higher and higher. It is also important to note that the actual number of cases that are occurring in the country is much, much higher than anything that is on these graphs. And that is because of the limitations in testing. So many people are actually, in fact, getting COVID and spreading COVID without even knowing that they, in fact, have the disease. Another way of looking at the information is to take a look at this map. And we can see on this map the number of cases that are being tested and being found positive across the country. And you can see the high proportion of positive cases from tests, especially in Gauteng, where we know the third wave is being driven from. We expect this in due course to spread to other parts of the country. What's more concerning, though, that in the face of having a working vaccine, in fact, a number of working vaccines in the country, as it presently stands, only 0.8% of the population have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. And this is mainly healthcare workers and those people over the age of 60 who have registered and turned up for the vaccine. This is a big problem and a major concern to us, and partly what's driving this presentation today. We're now going to take a look at some of the medical vaccine technologies that are out there. And this is not just those pertaining to COVID-19, but other diseases as well. And this is to demonstrate that vaccines are not some newfangled technology which broke out in response to COVID. No, in fact, the Smallpox Vaccine, for example, goes all the way back to Dr. Edward Jenner in 1796. So we're all familiar with vaccines, and most of us since birth. They're actually very much part of responsible medical care and have prevented an estimated 4.5 billion viral illnesses since the 1960s alone. So let's take a look. The first vaccine type is the live attenuated vaccine, where a virus is weakened in some way and then introduced to the body to induce an immune response and protective effect. Examples here include the old measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, the smallpox vaccine, which I referred to a little earlier, chickenpox, yellow fever, and I'm sure you're very familiar with yellow fever if you've ever traveled anywhere, and the oral polio drops. The second kind is where they take a virus and then inactivate it completely and still introduce it to the body to induce an immune response. Examples here include hepatitis A, influenza. You're all very familiar with the flu vaccine, which is an annual vaccine in many cases, the more modern polio vaccine, and rabies. I'm going to skip very briefly to vaccines which are derived from bacteria, and you're familiar with these too: diphtheria, whooping cough, and tetanus. We've all had a tetanus injection, and we all know the importance of the so-called DTP vaccine, which are derived from bacteria. And then lastly, I'd like to take a look at these, which are the most important ones for our conversation today. They are called subunit or synthetic or recombinant vaccines, or what we call vaccine platforms. And they're aimed at diseases like hepatitis B, rubella, chickenpox, shingles, HPV, some of the experimental vaccines for HIV, and importantly, this is the basis for COVID-19 vaccines. And broadly speaking, there are two kinds. There are viral vector vaccines, where we take another virus and use it to introduce the necessary DNA, RNA, or protein subunits into the body so that an immune response can be formed, or the more modern technology called messenger RNA vaccines. These are the most important because these are the vaccine technologies being used in the response to COVID-19 today. Before we move on to explore these technologies around COVID in a little bit more detail, I'd just like to take you back to that commentary around smallpox. If you take a look at the picture on the left-hand side, you can see the two young boys clearly very different. The boy on the left has full-blown smallpox. The boy on the right, thought to be his brother, was somehow inoculated or vaccinated against smallpox, and the difference between the two is very clear. It is not known whether the young boy on the left-hand side survived the smallpox, but it is very obvious that the vaccine had a very prominent effect in protecting the boy on the right. The cartoon on the right-hand side is a commentary against the anti-vaxxer movement. And I just want to say in passing that vaccines do not cause autism or dementia or any other of the range of illnesses as peddled widely on the internet today. So let's move on now to have a look at some of these COVID vaccine technologies. Let's start by taking a look at the mRNA vaccine, since this is the one that is being used at present in the South African rollout. It's part of what the so-called Pfizer vaccine is. And it is important to note from this picture, and I'm going to play you a short video shortly, that no genetic material is woven into the human DNA. And this is no matter what the social media says. But to get a good idea of how this works, let's take a look at this brief video.
Developing vaccines is usually a very lengthy process, taking on average 8 years to get approved. Since a few years, we have the ability to create mRNA vaccines, which can be developed much faster. So how do these vaccines work? Are they safe, and how do they compare to traditional ones? But first you must understand how the immune system works. When a virus enters your body, it will attach itself to one of your cells and inject its DNA or RNA into it. This is like a blueprint for your cells, containing instructions on what the cell has to make. So in this case, the virus's RNA will tell your cell to make more copies of the same virus. They become factories assembling new copies of the virus that can infect even more cells. But don't worry, our bodies have a defense system for foreign intruders. The immune system attacks any protein, virus, or bacteria that does not belong in our bodies, but it takes a few days for it to learn how to attack the intruder. Meanwhile, the virus factories are running non-stop, quickly replicating the virus and spreading it in your body. In other words, you start experiencing symptoms of whatever has infected you. After a few days, however, your immune system will have figured out how to attack the virus and will start producing antibodies. These attach themselves to the virus, preventing them from infecting more cells and marking them for destruction. As you can see, the immune system is remarkable, but it's slow to mount an attack. That is the reason why we can get sick in the first place. So to give it a helping hand, we developed vaccines. The main idea is to train your immune system to recognize and fight off an infection before it has occurred. Almost like showing your immune system a mugshot of the virus and saying, if you see this, kill it. There are various types of vaccines, but let's take a look at the new kid on the block, mRNA vaccines. To understand how they work, let's take the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. You might have seen pictures of the virus with its distinctive spikes. These spikes allow the virus to attach to specific cells in your body and infect them. Now, here's the key idea for the COVID-19 vaccine. What if we could train our immune system to recognize these spikes by having our own bodies produce them? To do that, researchers took the virus's blueprint, its RNA, and isolated the part responsible for producing the spikes. Armed with this blueprint, they created mRNA, or messenger RNA. This is a special form of RNA that can enter your cells and give them instructions. In this case, the RNA contains instructions to build the spikes of the coronavirus. Not the virus itself, just the spikes. So mRNA vaccines contain instructions for your cells that tell them to build a part of a virus in large volumes, almost like giving them a recipe to follow. Once this is happening, your immune system kicks into action and starts learning how to attack these intruders. Again, it takes some time for the immune system to fight off these spikes, but you won't get sick because it's only the spikes, not the virus itself. And that's it. Your immune system has learned how to attack the spikes of the coronavirus. It destroys all the spikes and even breaks down the mRNA vaccine itself. The only thing left in your body are special B cells or memory cells. These can linger around for months or years until the same virus infects you again. When that happens, the B cells can produce the correct antibodies right away, preventing the virus from spreading and making you sick. What's interesting about this mRNA technique is that it's relatively quick to develop a vaccine as soon as we know the DNA or RNA sequence of a virus. And secondly, because the vaccine only makes our bodies produce a tiny part of a virus, we cannot get sick from it. More traditional vaccines use weakened versions of the actual virus. This also triggers an immune response, but could also give you mild symptoms. Now you know how mRNA vaccines work.
Moving on to the second technology, that of the vaccine vector against coronavirus. We're not going to get into too much detail on this vector-based approach, and I'll leave it to you to read up more on it if you wish to. But basically the approach here is to use a weakened adenovirus, the common cold virus, and that may be a human adenovirus or a primate adenovirus, which is the delivery mechanism to actually present the spike protein gene code to the immune system. This is the mechanism used by the Janssen or J&J vaccine that was used earlier against in the healthcare worker program. And once again, I just want to state clearly, there is no weaving of the gene fragment in any way into the human DNA. So please do explore this second area of vaccination technology at your leisure and see how it works. I'm sure it will be very informative. So now we've explored how vaccines work in the individual, but what's the effect in the community and why is it so important that we take part in vaccination campaigns? Let's take a look at this video to help explain.
Infectious diseases are caused by pathogens like viruses or bacteria that can jump from one person to the next. So how can we stop the cycle of transmission? The simple answer is immunity. Immunity is our body's ability to resist a pathogen via the immune system. Today we'll talk about herd immunity. Immunity zoomed out to the level of the population. To understand herd immunity, we first need to understand how we become immune to pathogens and how herd immunity works under ideal circumstances. Our bodies can gain immunity to pathogens in one of two ways: by getting and recovering from an infection, also known as natural immunity, or by receiving a vaccination. In both cases, our bodies generate a type of immunity called acquired immunity, which is like a protective shield for our bodies against outside invaders, similar to a moat around a castle. Acquired immunity can give us long-lasting immune protection through antibodies, proteins that help our immune systems recognize and destroy pathogens. For infectious diseases, this not only protects you from getting sick when you're exposed to the pathogen for a second time, but can also prevent you from spreading the disease to other people. This is a great way to prevent the spread of disease because the more people in a population who become immune, the less that pathogen is able to jump from person to person, essentially breaking the cycle of transmission. When enough people in a population become immune, the rest of the population is protected by proxy, establishing herd immunity. This is particularly important for people whose immune systems are too fragile to develop natural immunity or get a vaccination, like the elderly, the very young, or those who are immunocompromised. Let's take a look at this idea visually, considering a viral infection. When a new virus enters a population with no immunity, it can spread unchecked because the people in that population don't have the protective antibodies. As more people gain immunity, the number of infected individuals diminishes. This decreases the likelihood that an infected person will transmit the disease to someone susceptible. What happens as this continues? At a certain point, the virus runs out of places to go, and the spread of the virus is under control. Even those who haven't been infected or vaccinated are protected. We have achieved herd immunity. Achieving herd immunity requires the number of immune individuals to reach a certain threshold. So what is that threshold? The herd immunity threshold is calculated based on a number called R0, which refers to the average number of people an infected person spreads the disease to in a completely susceptible population. Using the estimated R0 for a pathogen, we can estimate the number of people who need to become immune for herd immunity to take effect. So the higher the R0, the more people who need to develop immunity to block sustained transmission. Let's take a look at this visually. For a pathogen that spreads very easily or is highly communicable, say one with an R0 of 5, many more individuals need to become immune to reach the herd immunity threshold. For a pathogen that spreads relatively more slowly, one with an R0 of 2 for example, less people need to develop immunity before herd immunity becomes protective. For the COVID-19 pandemic, R0 is approximately 3, and our mathematical model to calculate the herd immunity threshold tells us that theoretically 2/3 of the population would have to become immune in order to slow down and eventually stop the spread of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. In a population of 300 million, for example, 200 million people would need to be immune to reach the herd immunity threshold. So how infectious a pathogen is matters. Another important variable is time. Although immunity to some pathogens is long-lasting and in some cases lifelong, immunity to other pathogens can wane over time, either because the pathogen mutates to avoid the antibodies or because the cells that make protective antibodies are lost. Short-lived immunity means that in some cases, herd immunity cannot be achieved because there's always a large proportion of the population that is susceptible. What does this mean for COVID-19? We don't know yet, as we are still trying to understand how long natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2 lasts, and whether we can elicit long-term immunity with a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. Long-term immunity is key to determining if herd immunity will be protective for COVID-19. Let's recap. Herd immunity is the indirect protection from infection conferred to susceptible individuals when a sufficiently large proportion of immune individuals exist in a population. Achieving herd immunity is a complex and dynamic process, dependent on multiple factors, including the nature of the infectious pathogen and the type of immunity it generates. Herd immunity cannot quell a disease outbreak, but it is a critical way to prevent the spread and damage of an infectious agent across the global community. For some pathogens, the herd immunity threshold can be gradually established via natural infection. But for most, effective vaccinations are critical to reach the numbers necessary to achieve herd immunity. You can learn more about herd immunity in the primer by Luis Barrero and Haley Randolph in the journal Immunity. Thank you for joining us today. We are Eureka Science, and this is a collaboration with Cell Press.
Right, we're nearly past all the technical stuff, but there is one more area that I'd like to explore with you. And that are the different types of COVID vaccines that are relevant to us globally and in South Africa today. And you can see broadly there are several different vaccine types that are out there. You've probably all heard of the Mrna, the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, as well as the Janssen or Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and a little earlier in the year, the Astrazeneca vaccine. The Mrna vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, and the second one is the one that we're using in South Africa today, are mRNA vaccines, as we explained a little earlier. Whereas the Janssen vaccine, which was used in the Sisonke trial amongst healthcare workers, is a human adenovirus spiked protein gene type vaccination. It is important to note, and I'm just going to dwell on the two in red, that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is 95% effective in general, around 75% effective against the South African variant, but importantly is 100% effective, or close to 100% anyway, in preventing severe disease, as worked out in completed phase 3 trials. It is a 2-dose vaccine, and those of you who have been participating in the vaccine program will know that you've had phase 1 vaccine and you can have a second vaccine around 42 days later. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, slightly less effective against the South African variant in terms of getting the disease in the first place, but importantly is a single-dose vaccine and is close to 100% effective in preventing death. They also have very different cold storage requirements. Just in passing, the Astrazeneca vaccine is actually a chimpanzee adenovirus vector type virus, and is very low in its effectiveness against the South African variant. Hence, it was abandoned in favor of these other two a little earlier. But before I move on, I want to re-emphasize that vaccines are not 100% effective in preventing you from becoming infected with COVID. However, they are extremely effective in preventing severe disease and death. And this is even thought to apply to the new Delta variant, the one that comes across from India that is moving through South Africa in our third wave. This information is absolutely key. Right now, hospital beds and ICU beds in South Africa are completely oversubscribed. Around 60% or even more of people who are admitted to an ICU with COVID right now and are placed on a ventilator will leave that ICU on a gurney. And doctors are desperately trying to treat the severely ill and dying, and they have to make some really tough decisions on who gets a bed. If a 50-year-old with no comorbidities lands up coming into the ICU and is being weighed up against a 75-year-old with comorbidities, I can assure you the first will be admitted and the other will not, if there is no space. This is agonizing for both the families and the caregivers, and especially the caregivers who have to make this decision several times a day. Please consider this very carefully as you think through the COVID vaccine issues once I've completed this presentation. So let's get on from the technical and now into the actual vaccine rollout plan for South Africa. Phase 1 has been well communicated, focused on healthcare workers, and began in February earlier this year. It ran as a research study, but now we are firmly in phase 2 of the vaccine rollout plan, where essential workers, persons living in congregate settings, and especially people over the age of 60 and those over 18 with comorbidities is in place right now. This is the phase that is rolling out and regrettably is attracting less than optimal attention. We have a later phase, probably following in the months to come, that will target the other members of the adult population. So right now, it's especially important to focus this on the people who are over the age of 60 and those with comorbidities. And fresh out of the block information is that this will be extended to individuals over the age of 50 from July. So if you haven't been vaccinated, please think very carefully through what I've just said now and what I mentioned about the concerns of this particular wave. Right, so let's move on to the benefits of COVID vaccination. And they occur at two levels, at the personal level and at the community level. If we start by looking at the personal level, there is a reduction of personal risk. As you've seen from the statistics I shared a little earlier, the vaccines are very effective in reducing your chances of infection. But more importantly, they reduce your chances of severe illness or hospitalization, especially if you're an individual at high personal risk, such as somebody who has diabetes or hypertension or is obese. And they are very effective in preventing death from COVID disease. With respect to the community, as we've seen from that video, COVID vaccination reduces the rate of spread, it reduces the chance of your infection infecting others, and it frees up the constrained healthcare resources that are out there at the moment, hopefully towards herd immunity. So these are the benefits of COVID vaccination. So we've considered the benefits of COVID vaccination, but it's only fair to consider some of the reasonable concerns that you may have regarding COVID vaccines, so-called vaccine hesitancy. And I'm going to deal with a few of these now. The first of these is that COVID vaccines contain stem cells from aborted fetuses. And I'd like to say very emphatically that COVID vaccines do not contain any human cellular matter at all. What is pertinent, though, is that those adenovirus vectors that I mentioned a little earlier are in fact grown in HEC293 or PER-C6 stem cell lines. We use cells to actually grow the viruses, and those viruses are then used to introduce the vaccine into the body, and from there the material into the cells. Now, the HEC293 stem cell line was originally derived from a kidney from an aborted fetus back in the 1970s. And these stem cells and other stem cell lines are widely used in medical research today. But firstly, the stem cells are removed from the vaccines. They are not in the vaccine material. And those cells in which these vaccines are grown are now only distantly related to that original fetal cell. Now, I relate to a Scottish heritage. My grandfather and his great-grandfather and his father before him come from Scotland. So there is a very strong chance that there is some elements of my DNA that may well have come from Robert the Bruce. But you'd be quick to agree with me that because I may have some genes that are originally derived from Robert the Bruce, that I'm not Robert the Bruce. And the same might be true if we go all the way back to Adam. We certainly contain in our DNA many of the genes that Adam would have had, but that doesn't make us Adam or Eve. In the same way, the cell lines that are used to actually help create and test these vaccines are not in the vaccine themselves and are not from an aborted fetus. I'd like to add also that the Pfizer and the Mrna vaccine, especially the Pfizer since that's relevant to South Africa, is completely synthetic and was not derived from some kind of stem cell line. The next reasonable concern would be that vaccines haven't been properly tested and may not be safe. While these platform vaccine technologies that I mentioned, whilst the vaccine itself is very new, developed in under a year in most cases, the underlying platform has been in development for well over 13 to 15 years. And all of these vaccines undergo major clinical trials, so-called phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, on hundreds of thousands of patients, and are subject to a rigorous scientific process and peer review, with drug safety and monitoring boards checking to see that companies are not deviating from the required good clinical practice standards. And then the data is published in the major scientific literature for critical review. And then regulatory agencies such like South Africa's SAHPRA or the Food and Drug Administration, so-called FDA, also do their own independent reviews. I do find it quite interesting that the anti-vaxxer voices that so often use this as the basis on which you shouldn't receive a vaccine are often the same voices shouting loudly for the unscientific introduction of unproven drugs, such as ivermectin, and I'm sure you've read much of that on the internet and social media. The last two reasonable concerns I'd like to go into that vaccines may cause serious side effects and that vaccines will alter your DNA. So yes, vaccines may cause serious side effects. The most touted are blood clots or allergic shock. But all medications and vaccines carry a side effect profile and risk. Penicillin may cause an allergic risk, so can paracetamol or prawns if you happen to be allergic to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that you're going to use prawns as a medication, but you get the point. The key point is that COVID vaccines are no more different in terms of their allergic side effect profiles or other risk profiles than any other medication. And very importantly, the risks of side effects from COVID vaccines are rare, very rare. And in any event, they are much rarer than the risks that you may gain from contracting COVID itself and becoming seriously ill, especially in the elderly and those with comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. In the rare event that you suffer from an allergic reaction to a vaccine, we can treat the problem, usually quite simply. But I've already mentioned the desperate state of bed availability of those who become seriously ill with COVID. The risks aren't worth comparing. Secondarily, there's this issue that's going around on the internet that COVID vaccines will somehow alter your DNA. Again, let me state that COVID vaccines do not contain human DNA. They do not enter the human cell nucleus, and the DNA or the RNA that is introduced is not in any way incorporated into human DNA. And in any event, further, the mRNA and even the adenovirus vectors and other proteins are rapidly destroyed by the now trained immune system. So I hope I've dealt with some of your reasonable concerns relating vaccine hesitancy. Let's take a look now at some of the vaccine myths. Now, in the following slides, there are a number of links that I can leave you with to download at your leisure later on and explore for further information. But generally speaking, these vaccine myths are either about some form of global profit conspiracy. The big pharma out there creates a disease and then they create the vaccine and they make a big profit from all of that. Or a global control conspiracy. The so-called Illuminati is going to take over the world and a small group of individuals is controlling everything that's going on. There's a well-known 5G conspiracy that in fact COVID is not a disease at all, but is a reaction of the body to 5G radio waves from cellular signals. This is fairly obviously difficult to even believe on the grounds that many countries in the world are facing severe COVID epidemics and they have no 5G. In fact, the same type of thinking was imported to 4G and 3G before that. So strongly there's the sense that a suspicion is out there that big business or a secret group is out to run the world. And then I will come back to this, the mark of the beast conspiracy, and this is particularly important to us as Christians. But all of the marks of a conspiracy can be well seen as either having contradictory information, an overriding sense of suspicion that something is wrong, nefarious intent against persecuted victims, and all of these conspiracies are immune to the evidence when presented against them, and in fact are really a way of reinterpreting randomness. Even when the contradictions or the evidence is presented to people and is pointed out, well, then they say, well, something must be wrong nonetheless, and the conspiracy carries on. The most interesting one, for example, is in a video called Plandemic, and I've given you the link later on, where there's contradictory information, such as the coronavirus came from a secret Chinese laboratory. And in the same video, the same scientist says, but we are all actually carriers of COVID virus anyway, and the activation of masks causes the disease to break out. So on the one hand, the scientist says it came from a Chinese lab, and on the other hand, they say, well, no, we actually all had it already, and by wearing a mask is how you're going to get sick. When this is pointed out, you can see how the people react. And with respect to reinterpreting randomness, if you've ever watched the movie A Beautiful Mind, you'll get an idea of what the reinterpretation of randomness looks like in the extreme. Although I point out, that movie is actually about the brilliant mathematician John Nash, who had a mental illness and was not a conspiracy theorist. But you can get a sense of how the effects spread and how damaging they are. And now you add social media. And together with these conspiracy theories and a fantastic mechanism of spreading them, many groups are fearful of vaccines and the obvious benefits that I've mentioned a little earlier. But hopefully now, armed with the knowledge of how they work and what works, you'll be able to combat this, what we call plandemic myth, with a bit more vigor and with a bit more insight. Here's some further links that you can take a look to. In this particular video, which I won't play, a strong case is made for these vaccines containing fetal cells. Have a look at the video when you get a chance, and also take a look at the kind of company these videos keep. And you may well be amazed. I mentioned then this particular video, Plandemic, and here is a commentary on Plandemic, which then in further detail will take you through some of these elements of conspiratorial thinking and how they work. Once again, I leave this to you for your later study if you find it interesting. Now, I said I specifically wanted to mention the mark of the beast, because this is a particular conspiracy theory that does the round in Christian circles. The so-called mark of the beast, coming from the book of Revelation, indicates that non-believers will somehow be marked in a way that will prevent them from trading or from being part of society. And the fear is that the COVID vaccine is in fact that mark, either through the introduction of some sort of nano chip, or some kind of marking on the skin, or some marking or kind of vaccine passport that indicates that you have this mark of the so-called beast. Now, it's important, and go and read the Revelation very carefully. The mark of the beast is not some kind of medical procedure, and in fact, in past history, things like barcodes, credit cards, ID numbers, social security numbers, Ronald Reagan and many others were so-called marks of the beast, all of which have been proven to be false. What is important, though, is to note that the mark in the book of Revelation is a mark of exclusive worship of the beast and his image in rejecting Christ, as opposed to those marked as belonging to the Lamb. Go and have a look at the book of Revelation, and especially the indication links that I've given you there. And be reminded that the book of Revelation is not a revelation about the devil's nefarious purposes on the world. But as it says in chapter 1, verse 1, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ about what is to come. And if all of those are true, and what Jesus is saying is true, you can't protect against a spiritual onslaught with human protests and social media messaging. They can only be protected against by the blood of the Lamb. And importantly, Christians, brothers and sisters, you can't be tricked out of sealing in the Holy Spirit by a vaccine. You can't give up your salvation because you're taking on a vaccine. Look at 2 Corinthians 1, verses 21 and 22. Now it is God who makes both us and you stand firm in Christ. He anointed us, set his seal of ownership upon us, and put his Spirit in our hearts as a deposit guaranteeing what is to come. If the Spirit is our guarantee, it is absurd to think that somehow taking on a vaccine could trick you out of what Jesus died for on the cross. So, brothers and sisters in Christ, let's please remember that God is sovereign. Whilst I presented some passages here for you to go and look up, let's just have a look at a few. And firstly, salvation is not a matter of vaccination. There's nowhere in the scriptures that say that vaccination will or won't lead you to salvation. In Romans 8, 38 and 39, Paul writes, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Anything else in all creation, and that includes COVID-19 vaccines, cannot separate you from the love of Christ. God can and will protect his saints into eternity. John 6:39, "And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of those that he has given me, but raise them up at the last day." What greater certainty can we have? And then lastly, that COVID-19 is not outside of God's sovereignty. Take note of Matthew 28, verse 18, where Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." COVID-19 is not some exception. Now, I do need to point out to you that these points are specially made to those who are God's saints and who know Jesus Christ as their Savior. If you do know him, this should be of great comfort in this day and age of epidemic and vaccination. But if you don't know him, whilst the vaccine discussions of this presentation are still very relevant to you, I do suggest that you face a much more grave danger than COVID, one with eternal consequences, one which COVID may in fact usher you into when you least expect it. And if so, and this is your case, I urge you to talk to one of the pastors or a Christian friend as a matter of great urgency. So what about the dangers of fake news? Well, it confuses people and makes the truth difficult to discern, and we've seen this in so many groups, even amongst us in the church. It drives wedges between peoples and communities. It changes perceptions, beliefs, and attitudes, but on false premises. And it plays on our tendency to believe that which we believed in the first place. Anything that confirms our bias, we believe more quickly. But perhaps more sinister is the fact that fake news can ultimately force behavior change and even dangerous action. Consider the number of people who have bet their lives and their financial circumstances on very poor decisions driven by fake news, or even lost their lives, often driven by outside agendas or something that people are just fooling about with. And it is so easy to spread this news via the internet and social media. Every one of us can, I am absolutely sure, associate with the various kinds of messages coming through on WhatsApp or on Twitter or on Facebook that just has no basis in reality. And all of this is contrary to biblical principle and commandment. Just to cite Psalm 34, whoever of you loves life and desires to see many good days, keep your tongues from evil and your lips from telling lies. So watch out for fake news and don't let it unnecessarily influence you or worry you, especially with respect to COVID-19 vaccination. So let's summarize. Where do we end up? Firstly, vaccine science, as I've shown you, is sound, regulated, reviewed, and safe. You can go and check this up in any of the reputable journals that are out there. Secondarily, personal vaccination is extremely rational to protect you and your community. And COVID is not an exception in this case. And you are very familiar with vaccination. We all are. And we found it rational in the past. It ought to be rational in the future. I do have respect for people who have vaccine hesitancy. And I note at this point that no one will be vaccinated against their will, and that people with personal conscience issues and spiritual convictions must be respected. I do need to say, though, that your personal decision not to be vaccinated will not be free of consequence, however. So you may end up becoming seriously ill, and you may end up needing admission, of which there is no available admission, and you may not be able to seek treatment. Your company, for example, may require you to be vaccinated for occupational health and safety purposes. So you may not be vaccinated against your will, but you will not be free of the consequences of that. But if we have respect for vaccine hesitant individuals, I want to please urge you to have equal respect for those who accept vaccines as a rational way forward. And then lastly, spot the fake news and the conspiracy theories. Have a look at them and say, does what you receive in your inbox make sense? And avoid the pitfalls of the social media easy believism. And then critically important, remember that God is sovereign in all of this. And as a Christian, you have much to look forward to and much to thank Him for in providing these medical technologies as well as rational minds on which to make a good and sound decision. So lastly, what now? What do I recommend? And firstly, I just want to say that this is not medical information for the individual. You do need to discuss that with your healthcare practitioner if you have any doubts or concerns. But in broad principles, should I get vaccinated? Absolutely yes, especially if you're over the age of 60. And in fact, that number has been reduced to over the age of 50 from July. Especially if you have hypertension, diabetes, obesity, chronic lung disease, or frailty. You should get vaccinated if you're a healthcare worker, and to that I might add teachers and other critical and essential workers. And note that pregnancy is not a contraindication absolutely of vaccination. So there are some considerations to the question, should I be vaccinated? And also take into account everything that I've shared with you a little earlier. If you do decide to get vaccinated, what do you need to do? Well, you need to register on the Evds system. And I've provided you the link there, which is available from any good search or from the link that's actually in this presentation. And in fact, many sites will accept you if you're over the age of 60 as a walk-in, provided you have your ID with you. If you need to find out more, you can go to any one of the many good sites, and I've just listed one there, the National Institute of Communicable Diseases. You can also go to the New England Journal of Medicine or to the Johns Hopkins University for some really good and sound vaccine advice. Or talk to your healthcare practitioner. Your doctor knows what's going on and sympathizes with the challenges faced in our community, especially in this third wave. So talk to your healthcare practitioner if you're uncertain. And as I said a little earlier, if you're uncertain as to the bigger things, the spiritual things, then please, I would encourage you to talk to either Pastor Clinton or one of the elders or a good Christian friend who can help you. So friends, thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. I hope it has been helpful in helping you form a solid position on COVID vaccination and to decide what to do when facing this third wave. Again, I would like to acknowledge the support from Dr. Michelle Groom in putting this presentation together, as well as the support from the elders of Honey Ridge Baptist Church. May God bless you with wisdom and assurance in the weeks that lie ahead. Thank you for watching.